Patricia Whitmore had lived on Oakmont Circle in suburban Richmond for 31 years when she made a 911 call that would destroy her reputation, cost her city $3.9 million, and expose a neighborhood association that had received 23 similar complaints about her in 6 years. She was 67 years old, retired from a successful career in real estate, old enough to understand the consequences of racial profiling, but apparently convinced that her 31 years of residence gave her the authority to police who belonged in her neighborhood. One Saturday afternoon in May, she looked out her window and saw a black man in a gray Audi sedan pulled halfway into a driveway 3 houses down, changing what appeared to be a flat tire. In Patricia Whitmore's mind, that image didn't compute. Black men didn't belong on Oakmont Circle. Black men changing tires in driveways had to be criminals casing houses or stealing cars. What Whitmore did next, confronting him without evidence, dismissing his explanations, and calling 911 to report a suspicious person, despite being told he lived there, would become proof of how racial bias transforms neighbors into accusers and residential streets, into crime scenes for people who committed no crime except existing while black. And the man she reported? Justice Marcus Henderson, a Virginia State Supreme Court justice, a man who'd spent 23 years on the bench, 15 years before that as a prosecutor, and 7 years living 3 houses away from Patricia Whitmore. A black man in his mid-50s, Justice Marcus Henderson, was kneeling beside his gray Audi A6 in the driveway of his brick colonial home on a warm Saturday afternoon. His suit jacket was draped over the passenger seat. His tie was loosened. A hydraulic jack sat beside the rear driver's side tire. No crime, no trespassing, no disturbance. Just a judge changing a flat tire at his own house after returning from a legal conference. But Patricia Whitmore saw him through assumptions so rigid that she couldn't imagine a black man as a legitimate neighbor. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us expose patterns of bias that destroy lives and waste millions in taxpayer money. Oakmont Circle sits in the Woodland Heights subdivision of Richmond, Virginia, about 15 minutes west of downtown. It's an affluent residential enclave developed in the early 1990s, the kind of neighborhood where homes start at $800,000 and climb to well over $1.5 million. Mature oak trees line the streets. Brick colonials and modern farmhouses sit on half-acre lots. 3-car garages. Landscaped lawns maintained by professional services. A private community pool and tennis courts sit at the entrance. It's the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. Where residents wave from driveways and complain about porch pirates at homeowners. Association meetings. Where people jog in the evenings and walk dogs in the mornings, and generally feel entitled to know exactly who belongs and who doesn't. Justice Marcus Henderson lived at 428 Oakmont Circle, a 4-bedroom brick colonial with white columns and black shutters, set back from the street with a circular driveway. He'd purchased it 7 years earlier, after his appointment to the state Supreme Court, moving his family from a smaller home in the city to this quiet suburban street where his daughters could attend top-rated schools, and he could have space to work from home when the court wasn't in session. Patricia Whitmore lived at 409 Oakmont Circle, directly across the street and 3 houses down. A sprawling ranch-style home she'd lived in since 1993. She knew the neighborhood's history, its politics, its gossip. She served on the Homeowners Association board for 12 years. She organized the annual 4th of July block party. She considered herself the neighborhood's unofficial guardian, the person who noticed things, who kept watch, who made sure standards were maintained. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday in May. Temperature in the low 70s, sunny, light breeze. The kind of pleasant spring afternoon where people washed cars and mowed lawns and worked in gardens. Several neighbors were outside. A couple walking their dog. A teenager shooting hoops. A woman pruning roses. Justice Henderson had just returned from a legal conference in Charlottesville. He'd pulled into his driveway and heard the telltale sound of air hissing from his rear tire. Slow leak? Probably a nail or screw picked up on the highway. He parked, grabbed his jack from the trunk, and got to work. Routine maintenance. Nothing unusual, Nothing suspicious. Except Patricia Whitmore was watching. And in her mind, what she saw wasn't a neighbor fixing a tire. It was a threat. Justice Marcus Henderson had been on the Virginia State Supreme Court for 23 years when Patricia Whitmore decided he didn't belong in his own driveway. 23 years presiding over the state's highest court, writing opinions that shaped Virginia law on everything from criminal procedure to civil rights, constitutional interpretation to corporate liability. Before that, he'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor in the Richmond Commonwealth's attorney's office, building a reputation for thoroughness, fairness, and an ability to see cases from every angle. He'd prosecuted violent felonies, financial crimes, public corruption. He'd won convictions that held up on appeal because he built airtight cases based on evidence, not assumptions. His colleagues called him principled. His clerks called him demanding but fair. Legal scholars cited his opinions in academic journals. He'd mentored dozens of young attorneys. He'd spoken at law schools across the state. He was widely considered one of the most respected jurists in Virginia history. Henderson had graduated from Howard University with honors, then earned his J.D. from the University of Virginia School of Law, where he'd been an editor on the Virginia Law Review and clerked for a federal appellate judge. After law school, he'd clerked for a justice on the Virginia Supreme Court, the same court he would later join. He'd published articles on constitutional law. He'd received the Virginia State Bar's Lewis F. Powell, Jr. Award for Professionalism. He'd been recognized by the National Bar Association for his contributions to civil rights jurisprudence. His appointment to the state Supreme Court at age 32 had made headlines. One of the youngest justices in Virginia history, and one of the few black justices to serve on the court at that time. At 55 years old, Justice Marcus Henderson was at the peak of an extraordinary legal career. He was married to Dr. Vanessa Henderson, a pediatrician at VCU Medical Center. They had 2 daughters, Alicia, 16, a sophomore at a magnet school in Richmond, and Maya, 13, in 8th grade. He coached Maya's youth basketball team. He volunteered with a mentorship program for first-generation law students. On weekends, he worked in his garden, read biographies, and occasionally played golf, though he'd never gotten particularly good at it. He was methodical in everything he did, patient, thoughtful, the kind of person who approached problems systematically, whether it was a complex legal question or a flat tire. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He worked through things step by step. He'd lived on Oakmont Circle for 7 years. He'd met several neighbors, attended a few block parties, waved when he saw people in their yards. He wasn't particularly social. His work kept him busy, but he was friendly, courteous, the kind of neighbor who kept his property maintained and didn't cause problems. But he was also realistic. He knew exactly what it meant to be a black man in an affluent white neighborhood. He knew that some people would see his success as an anomaly, his presence as suspicious, his legitimacy as something requiring proof. He'd experienced it before. Store employees following him, security guards asking questions, assumptions that he was in the wrong place. It came with the territory. It was exhausting, infuriating, but it was reality. That Saturday, Henderson had driven to Charlottesville for a Virginia Bar Association conference on emerging issues in state constitutional law. He delivered a keynote address on judicial independence and left around 2:30 p.m. to get home before dinner. The drive back took just over an hour. He'd pulled onto Oakmont Circle at 3:45 p.m., noticed the tire pressure warning light on his dashboard, and heard the hissing sound as soon as he parked. He got out, inspected the tire, and saw the problem, a small puncture, probably from a screw or nail. The tire was losing air slowly but steadily. He could drive it to a shop, but he didn't want to risk damaging the rim. Better to change it now and take the flat tire, to be repaired Monday. He pulled the spare, the jack, and the lug wrench from his trunk. He removed his suit jacket, draped it over the passenger seat, and loosened his tie. He wore gray dress slacks, a white dress shirt with the sleeves still buttoned, and black dress shoes. Professional attire, though slightly rumpled from the drive. He positioned the jack under the frame, started lifting the car, and began loosening the lug nuts. Routine work. He'd changed tires before. It would take maybe 20 minutes. His Virginia Supreme Court identification badge was in his wallet in his pocket. His vehicle registration was in the glove compartment. His driver's license showed his address, 428 Oakmont Circle. Everything about him, his car, his clothing, his presence, suggested exactly what he was, a professional man who lived there. But Patricia Whitmore had been watching from her living room window, and she'd decided this didn't look right. To Patricia Whitmore, Marcus Henderson's presence in that driveway was an intrusion, a violation of the neighborhood's character, a threat to property values and safety, and she was going to do something about it. Patricia Whitmore was 67 years old. She'd been a resident of Oakmont Circle since the development was built in 1993, one of the original homeowners. She'd retired 6 years earlier after a 35-year career in residential real estate, selling luxury homes in Richmond's wealthiest suburbs. She was proud of her career, proud of her home, proud of her neighborhood. She considered herself vigilant, concerned about maintaining standards, deeply invested in preserving what she called the character of Oakmont Circle. Her neighbors described her as opinionated, sometimes overbearing, the kind of person who noticed every lawn that wasn't mowed on schedule and every car parked on the street overnight. In the 6 years since Patricia Whitmore retired and began spending more time at home, the Oakmont Circle Homeowners Association had received 23 formal complaints about her behavior. 23. 14 of them involved allegations that she'd confronted people of color, contractors, landscapers, delivery drivers, visitors, and demanded to know why they were in the neighborhood. A Hispanic man installing a fence at a neighbor's house. Whitmore questioned whether he had permission to be there and called the homeowner to verify, despite seeing the company truck and work permit posted. An Asian woman delivering flowers. Whitmore followed her car through the neighborhood and wrote down the license plate, then reported it to the HOA as suspicious activity. A black teenager visiting a friend. Whitmore called the friend's parents to ask if they knew someone was at their house, because she was concerned about potential break-ins. 4 complaints involved Whitmore reporting vehicles she didn't recognize parked on the street or in driveways, demanding the HOA enforce parking policies that didn't exist. 3. Complaints involved Whitmore objecting to aesthetic changes neighbors made to their homes, paint colors, landscaping choices, holiday decorations, claiming they violated neighborhood standards even when they complied with all HOA rules. 2 complaints involved Whitmore attending HOA meetings and making inflammatory statements about declining property values if certain types of people were allowed to buy homes in the neighborhood. The pattern was unmistakable. Patricia Whitmore saw herself as the neighborhood's gatekeeper, and her gatekeeping had a clear racial dimension. White contractors were never questioned. White visitors were never reported. But people of color in the neighborhood triggered immediate suspicion, immediate intervention, immediate assumptions of wrongdoing. The HOA board had addressed it with her privately. They'd reminded her that Oakmont Circle was a diverse community, that questioning people based on appearance was inappropriate, that the HOA had no authority to police who visited or worked in the neighborhood. Whitmore would apologize, claim she was just being cautious, promise to be more mindful. Then she'd do it again. The board considered removing her, but worried about the optics, the potential legal challenges, the neighborhood drama. So they filed the complaints, documented the pattern, and hoped she'd eventually stop. She didn't. That Saturday afternoon, Patricia Whitmore was working in her garden when she noticed activity across the street. A gray Audi had pulled into the driveway at 428 Oakmont Circle. She watched as a black man got out, opened the trunk, and pulled out a jack. In Whitmore's mind, something was wrong. She knew the Henderson family lived there. She'd seen them at block parties, though she'd never actually spoken to them. She knew they were black, which bothered her more than she'd ever admit aloud. But the man she was watching didn't look like how she remembered Justice Henderson. The man changing the tire wore a white dress shirt and gray pants. But Whitmore had convinced herself that the judge always wore a full suit, always looked a certain way. This man looked too casual, too comfortable. He must be someone else. Maybe a relative, maybe a friend, maybe someone who didn't belong there. She watched for another 5 minutes, waiting to see if anyone came out of the house to greet him. No one did. In Whitmore's mind, that confirmed her suspicion. If he really lived there, someone would have come out. The fact that he was alone, working on a car, suggested he was up to something. She didn't consider that the family might not be home. She didn't consider that a man changing a tire in his own driveway wouldn't need supervision. She didn't consider calling the Hendersons to ask if everything was okay. She just knew, in her gut, that this was wrong. Whitmore walked across the street at 3:52 p.m., her mind filled with assumptions. She saw a black man in a driveway, working on an expensive car in a neighborhood where she believed he didn't fit. In her mind, he was either stealing the car, casing the house, or trespassing. She approached him directly, her voice sharp. "What are you doing on this property? Do you think neighbors should face financial consequences for racially motivated 911 calls against residents in their own homes? Drop your answer below." Justice Henderson was tightening the final lug nut when he became aware of someone standing behind him. He looked up and saw a white woman in her 60s, arms crossed, staring down at him with unmistakable suspicion. "What are you doing on this property?" Henderson blinked, confused. He recognized her vaguely from neighborhood events but couldn't remember her name. He kept his voice calm, professional. "Changing a flat tire? I live here." Whitmore's expression didn't soften. Her arms stayed crossed. Her posture radiated hostility. "This is a private street. Residents only." Henderson felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over him. He'd spent 23 years on the state's highest court. He'd written opinions on constitutional law. And here he was, being questioned about whether he belonged in his own driveway. "I am a resident. This is my house." 428 Oakmont Circle. Whitmore shook her head, her voice taking on an edge of certainty. "I've never seen you before. I don't think you belong here." Henderson stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from the trunk. He was still calm, but the irritation was building. He'd lived here for 7 years. 7 years of paying property taxes, maintaining his lawn, attending HOA meetings when his schedule allowed. And this woman was telling him he didn't belong. "Ma'am, I've lived at this address for 7 years. I'm Justice Marcus Henderson. I serve on the Virginia State Supreme Court. This is my home." Whitmore's face twisted with something between disbelief and disdain. "Judge, sure you are." Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it, showing his Virginia Supreme Court identification badge, a gold and blue credential with his photo, name, and title. "Here's my judicial ID, Justice Marcus Henderson, Virginia Supreme Court. Now I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish changing my tire." Whitmore barely glanced at the badge. She waved her hand dismissively. "I don't care what fake ID you have. You're trespassing, and I'm reporting a suspicious person." Henderson felt his patience snap. He'd shown her proof. He'd identified himself. He'd done everything required of him, and it wasn't enough. Because in Patricia Whitmore's mind, a black man couldn't possibly be a Supreme Court justice, couldn't possibly own a home on Oakmont Circle, couldn't possibly belong. "Ma'am, that's unnecessary. I'm happy to show you my vehicle registration, my driver's license." Whitmore pulled her phone from her pocket. "Stay right there. I'm calling the police." This is where commentary. This is where assumptions become accusations. This is where bias becomes so impenetrable that physical evidence, a state-issued judicial credential, a home address, a calm explanation, can't penetrate the narrative someone has constructed in their mind. Patricia Whitmore wasn't looking at Justice Marcus Henderson. She was looking at a black man in a driveway, and her decades of assumptions about who belonged in affluent neighborhoods and who didn't had already written the story. Everything after that, the credentials, the composure, the reasonable explanations, was filtered through that initial bias. The badge had to be fake. The explanation had to be a lie. The calm demeanor had to be manipulation. She wasn't protecting her neighborhood. She was enforcing her vision of who deserved to be there. Henderson's neighbor, David Chen, had been washing his car 2 houses down. He'd noticed Whitmore crossing the street, noticed her confrontational posture, and now he was walking over to see what was happening. "Patricia, is everything okay?" Whitmore barely turned, This man is trespassing. I'm calling the police. Chen looked at Henderson, then back at Whitmore, incredulous. That's Marcus. He lives there. He's a state Supreme Court justice. Whitmore ignored him. She was already dialing 911. Another neighbor, Sarah Martinez, had been walking her dog and stopped on the sidewalk, watching the confrontation. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Henderson addressed Whitmore one more time, his voice measured but firm. Ma'am, I'm asking you not to call the police. This is a misunderstanding. I live here. These are my neighbors. They can confirm it. Whitmore held up her hand, the phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person on Oakmont Circle in the Woodland Heights subdivision. There's a black male in a driveway, tampering with a vehicle. He's claiming he lives here, but I've never seen him before. He won't leave. I think he might be trying to steal the car. Henderson closed his eyes. He knew exactly what was coming. He'd seen it play out countless times. Black people arrested, detained, humiliated because someone called 911 and reported them for existing in spaces where they supposedly didn't belong. David Chen stepped forward, his voice sharp. Patricia, this is ridiculous. Marcus is our neighbor. You're calling the police on a man in his own driveway. I don't know that, and neither do you. Sarah Martinez spoke up from the sidewalk, her phone still recording. I can confirm it too. That's Justice Henderson. He lives there with his wife and 2 daughters. This is completely unnecessary. Whitmore turned her back on both of them, still speaking to the 911 dispatcher. Yes, he's still here. No, he hasn't threatened me, but he's refusing to leave. Can you send an officer? Henderson took a breath. He could feel the anger building, but he'd learned long ago that anger in situations like this only made things worse. He had to stay calm, had to document everything, had to let this play out and deal with the consequences later. He addressed the growing cluster of neighbors who'd stopped to watch. I'm Justice Marcus Henderson. I live at 428 Oakmont Circle. This woman is calling the police because she doesn't believe I belong here. I've shown her my judicial credentials. My neighbors have confirmed I live here, and she's proceeding anyway. Everyone here is a witness to this. Please record it if you can. 3 more phones came out. The footage would show everything. Henderson standing calmly beside his car with a flat tire. Whitmore on the phone with 911. Neighbors confirming Henderson's identity, and Whitmore refusing to acknowledge any of it. A police cruiser arrived 8 minutes later. Officer Amanda Torres, a 12-year veteran with the Richmond Police Department, pulled up to the curb. She got out slowly, assessing the scene. A black man in dress clothes standing beside an Audi with a flat tire, a white woman gesturing animatedly, and several neighbors with phones out. Torres had a bad feeling about this call. Should police departments require 911 operators to ask callers about the race of the person they're reporting and document it as a potential bias indicator? Let me know what you think. Officer Amanda Torres approached with her hands visible, non-threatening. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize when a call was going to be a problem. And this call, suspicious person, affluent neighborhood, multiple witnesses recording, had all the markers of a situation that could go sideways fast. Ma'am, I'm Officer Torres. You called about a suspicious person? Whitmore pointed at Henderson. Yes, this man is trespassing. He's been here for at least 20 minutes working on that car. I don't think he lives here. Torres turned to Henderson. Sir, can you tell me what's happening? Henderson kept his voice calm, professional. Officer, I'm Justice Marcus Henderson. I live at 428 Oakmont Circle. This is my home. I was changing a flat tire in my driveway when this woman approached me and accused me of trespassing. I showed her my Virginia Supreme Court judicial credentials. My neighbors, he gestured to David Chen and Sarah Martinez, have confirmed I live here, but she called 911 anyway. Torres's eyes widened slightly at the words Virginia Supreme Court. She looked at Henderson more carefully. Dress shirt, dress pants, professional appearance, working on an expensive sedan in a driveway. Do you have identification, sir? Henderson pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license and judicial credential. Torres examined both carefully. The license showed the address, 428 Oakmont Circle. The judicial credential was unmistakable. Official state seal, photo, title. Justice Marcus Henderson, Virginia Supreme Court. Torres walked to her patrol car and ran the information through her system. The verification came back immediately. Marcus Edward. Henderson, age 55, resident of 428 Oakmont Circle. No warrants, no criminal history. Registered vehicle matching the Audi in the driveway. Additional notation in the system. Judicial Officer, State Supreme Court. Torres returned to the group. Justice Henderson, I apologize for the interruption. Your identification and registration are all in order. You're obviously at your own residence. She turned to Whitmore, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Ma'am, this gentleman lives here. His neighbors have confirmed it. His identification confirms it. There's no crime here. No trespassing. No suspicious activity. He's changing a tire at his own home. Whitmore's face flushed. Well, I didn't know that. He didn't look like... Torres cut her off. Ma'am, you reported a person as suspicious and trespassing when multiple neighbors confirmed he lives here. You refused to accept his credentials. You wasted police resources on a call that never should have been made. Torres turned back to Henderson. Justice Henderson, on behalf of the Richmond Police Department, I sincerely apologize for this intrusion. You have every right to be here, and you shouldn't have been subjected to this. Henderson nodded, his expression neutral. Officer, I appreciate your professionalism, but I want this documented. I want a report filed that includes this woman's false accusation, the racial nature of this complaint, and the fact that I was targeted while performing routine maintenance at my own home. Torres nodded. Absolutely. I'll file a complete report. It'll include the 911 call recording, my body camera footage, and the witness statements from your neighbors. She looked at Whitmore again. Ma'am, you need to understand that calling 911 to report someone based solely on their race is not appropriate. It wastes police resources and harms community relationships. If this happens again, you could face consequences. Whitmore said nothing. She turned and walked back to her house, her posture stiff with embarrassment and resentment. David Chen approached Henderson. Marcus, I'm so sorry. That was completely uncalled for. Henderson managed a tired smile. It's not your fault, David, but thank you for speaking up. Officer Torres finished her report and left. Henderson completed changing his tire, but the damage was done. Multiple neighbors had recorded the entire confrontation. By evening, the videos were already starting to spread. Should officers be required to inform 911 callers about potential civil consequences for racially motivated false reports? Drop your answer. Within 24 hours, the footage had exploded across social media. Multiple angles from different neighbors. Whitmore confronting Henderson. Henderson showing his credentials. Neighbors confirming he lived there. Whitmore calling 911 anyway. Officer Torres's professional handling of the situation and her pointed remarks to Whitmore. Virginia Supreme Court Justice harassed in own. Driveway. Neighbor calls 911 on black judge changing tire. State's highest court justice forced to prove he owns his home after racist neighbor reports him as suspicious. Richmond judge targeted. White neighbor refuses to accept credentials, calls police on Justice Henderson. The outrage was swift and intense. The Virginia State Bar issued a statement condemning the incident. The NAACP called for accountability. Civil rights organizations demanded that Patricia Whitmore face consequences. Local news picked up the story. National outlets followed. Immediate consequences for Whitmore. Patricia Whitmore's life unraveled within 72 hours. Her identity was confirmed through public records and social media. Her address was shared. Her phone rang constantly with angry calls. Her email filled with messages ranging from disappointment to outright fury. The Oakmont Circle Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting. The board voted unanimously to remove Whitmore from her position and to permanently ban her from serving on any HOA committees. They issued a public statement apologizing to Justice Henderson and acknowledging their failure to address Whitmore's pattern of discriminatory behavior. Whitmore released a brief statement to a local news outlet. I made a mistake. I didn't recognize my neighbor, and I overreacted. I sincerely apologize to Justice Henderson and his family, but apologies don't undo trauma. And social media wasn't interested in apologies. Justice Henderson contacted civil rights attorneys within a week. The lawsuit, filed 3 months later, was comprehensive and devastating. The defendants, Patricia Whitmore, individually, the Oakmont Circle Homeowners Association, and the City of Richmond for the systemic failures that allowed such calls to be treated as legitimate emergency responses. The claims were extensive. Violation of civil rights under 42 U.S.C., paragraph 1983, deprivation of rights under color of law, racial discrimination and harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, false report to law enforcement with intent to harass, defamation, public accusation of criminal activity, negligent supervision and failure to act, against the HOA for ignoring 23 prior complaints documenting Whitmore's pattern of racial profiling. The complaint included Whitmore's complete history, 23 documented complaints over 6 years. 14 of them involved confrontations with people of color. Every single one dismissed by the HOA with promises that Whitmore would improve. All documented, all ignored. A pattern that culminated in a call to police targeting a sitting state Supreme Court justice in his own driveway. The lawsuit also included data from the Richmond Police Department, showing that calls from Oakmont Circle reporting suspicious persons had increased 340% since Whitmore retired and began spending more time at home. Of those calls, 87% involved people of color. 0 resulted in arrests or citations because in every case, the reported person had a legitimate reason to be there. The defendant's attorneys reviewed the evidence and reached identical conclusions. Indefensible. The videos were everywhere. The witnesses were credible and numerous. The pattern was documented by the HOA's own complaint records. Patricia Whitmore's 911 call, recorded and played on news broadcasts, was damning. There's a black male in a driveway tampering with a vehicle. Not, there's a person, a black male. Race was the first identifier she gave. The case settled 14 months after filing. Patricia Whitmore paid $1.2 million from her personal assets and homeowners insurance. The Oakmont Circle HOA paid $900,000 from their liability insurance. The City of Richmond paid $1.8 million total, $3.9 million to Justice Marcus Henderson. Additional terms included mandatory anti-bias training for all Oakmont Circle residents, adoption of an HOA policy prohibiting racially motivated complaints, Richmond Police Department policy requiring 911 operators to document caller descriptions and flag potential bias indicators, public apology from Patricia Whitmore, which she issued but which many found insufficient. Patricia Whitmore sold her home on Oakmont Circle 8 months after the settlement. She left Richmond entirely, relocating to Florida to escape the attention and condemnation. Her name became synonymous with racist 911 calls. Her case was cited in civil rights training materials. She'd spent 31 years building a reputation in Richmond real estate and community involvement, and she destroyed it in 8 minutes. Justice Henderson declined most media interviews, but issued a written statement through his attorneys. The $3.9 million represents accountability, but money doesn't restore the dignity of being treated as a criminal in your own driveway. It doesn't erase the humiliation of proving to your neighbors that you belong in a home you've owned for 7 years. The real question is whether this settlement changes anything, or whether it's just another payment that allows the underlying problem to continue. 3 months after the settlement, Justice Marcus Henderson testified at a Richmond City Council hearing on 911 reform. The council chambers were packed. His testimony was powerful, measured, and devastating. I'm Justice Marcus Henderson. I've served on Virginia's highest court for 23 years. Before that, I spent 15 years as a prosecutor in this city. I've dedicated my entire professional life to the law, to justice, to ensuring that our legal system treats people fairly regardless of their race, their background, their wealth. He paused, letting that sink in. On May 18th, I was changing a flat tire in my own driveway. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't threatening anyone. I was performing routine maintenance on my vehicle at my home. A home I've owned for 7 years. A home where I've raised my daughters, paid my taxes, and been a good neighbor. Another pause. Patricia Whitmore saw me and called 911, not because I was doing anything wrong, not because I was violating any law, but because I'm black, because in her mind, a black man in an affluent neighborhood must not belong there, must be up to something, must be a threat. His voice grew stronger. She'd been reported to the HOA 23 times for similar behavior. 23 times in 6 years. 14 of those complaints involved her confronting people of color and questioning their right to be in the neighborhood. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive, but the HOA did nothing. They filed the complaints, they noted the pattern, they warned her privately, and they left her in a position to continue targeting people. He looked directly at the council members. The city paid $1.8 million to settle my lawsuit. That's a significant amount of taxpayer money, but it doesn't change the underlying problem. Patricia Whitmore's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked racial bias that the HOA refused to address, and that our 911 system treated as legitimate emergency calls. Another pause, his expression serious. I'm a state Supreme Court justice. I had credentials. I had neighbors who confirmed my identity. I had the education, the resources, the platform to fight back. But what about everyone else? What about the delivery driver who gets questioned every week? What about the teenager walking home from a friend's house who gets detained because someone thinks he looks suspicious? What about the contractor working on a home who gets arrested because a neighbor doesn't think he belongs? He let the question hang in the air. If this can happen to me, with all my credentials, all my authority, all my visibility, what happens to people who don't have those things? That's the question this city needs to answer. The room was silent. Should homeowners associations face mandatory penalties and oversight after multiple documented complaints of racial profiling by residents? Drop your answer. This wasn't just about Patricia Whitmore. This wasn't just about one Saturday afternoon in May. This was about a system that validated her assumptions until she targeted someone with the power to fight back. Whitmore's record told the story the HOA ignored for 6 years. 23 complaints, 14 involving people of color. Every single one dismissed with warnings that never translated into consequences. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive, but the HOA treated each incident in isolation, never connecting them, never acknowledging that 23 complaints about the same behavior from the same person indicated a problem that required action. Consequence summary. Patricia Whitmore paid $1.2 million. She sold her home. She left Richmond. That's consequence. The HOA paid $900,000 and adopted new policies. That's accountability. The city paid $1.8 million and reformed its 911 response protocols. That's change. But money and policy reforms don't undo the trauma of being treated as a criminal in your own driveway. They don't restore the dignity of having to prove to your neighbors that you belong in a home you've owned for 7 years. They don't erase the message that even a state Supreme Court justice credential isn't enough to protect you from someone's racial assumptions. The real question is, what changes now? Do HOAs finally remove residents after 5 complaints instead of 23? Do they finally acknowledge that patterns of discriminatory behavior require intervention, not just documentation? Do 911 systems finally train dispatchers to recognize potentially racially motivated calls and handle them with appropriate skepticism? Do police departments finally require callers to justify suspicions with actual observed criminal behavior, rather than, "I don't think they belong here"? Do we finally acknowledge that making people uncomfortable often just means existing, while black in spaces where someone else thinks you don't belong? Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Patricia Whitmore in a position of neighborhood authority for 6 years, despite 23 documented complaints, if we don't address the culture that taught her a black man, changing a tire must be suspicious, then we're just waiting for the next Patricia Whitmore, the next Marcus Henderson, the next viral video that costs millions and changes nothing. Comment if you believe this should be law. Homeowners associations that fail to act on 3 or more complaints of racially motivated harassment against a resident face automatic state oversight, mandatory anti-bias training for all board members, and financial liability for subsequent incidents. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. Because we're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding better. We're going to keep fighting for the Supreme Court justices, the delivery drivers, the teenagers, the ordinary people who deserve to exist in public and private spaces without being criminalized for the color of their skin. This isn't just about one neighbor or one judge. It's about all of us and the world we're willing to tolerate. It's about whether we're okay with a system where 23 complaints get filed and ignored until someone with power and resources gets targeted. It's about whether we're going to accept that being black in an affluent neighborhood requires constantly proving you belong, constantly justifying your presence, constantly documenting your legitimacy. Because Marcus Henderson shouldn't have had to show his credentials. He shouldn't have had to explain himself. He shouldn't have had to endure 8 minutes of interrogation about whether he had the right to change a tire in his own driveway. But he did. And the $3.9 million says that was wrong. The question is, will we make sure it doesn't happen to the next person?